Here we go, and it's recording now.
All right.
Um, it is so nice to meet you. You go by Josh, right? Josh
Yeah.
Kemble.
Yeah.
Okay,
Uh-huh.
great.
And then
Josh
Meredith.
is yes.
Okay.
It is so nice to meet you. I was really taken by the email I got from you, which described your work. And the thing that your work is very, it sounds very absorbing and engaging. Like it took you a really long time to get
Yeah.
this most recent work out, which, if I'm correct, is called book 2. Is that the
Oh,
name of, like, book 1, 2 parts? Can you
yeah.
explain? Yeah.
Okay. So it's called Two Stories. I have a
Okay.
copy of it, but
Oh,
it
it's
just got released
beautiful.
today, and so I'm sure by the time this airs, like maybe later. But yeah. It's a two-part graphic novel. That's about sort of my struggles with mental illness and some issues of like losing faith and kind of regaining it. And it's told in a really like candid, kind of no holes barred way. And yeah, these are definitely time consuming pages. I hand letter and hand ink all of the pages and kind of draw pretty meticulously in a couple of varying styles to sort of fit the themes. But they're definitely very time consuming. Cartooning is it's like if you're a writer and you want your novel to kind of move at an even slower pace than a
You're going to
novelist when
draw
you're creating.
everything.
Yeah, because for every sentence you write, it's like that's potentially a week, of,
Can you
of drawing.
the camera? I just want to see the interior a little bit. Do you mind like just
Oh,
flipping it a bit?
yeah, of
Okay.
course. So
Thank you.
and I can show original pages, although I'm sure for like the
Okay, so
podcast that won't be super
I know.
exciting. But
I'm
so
just
it very
curious. I was curious about the different styles that I'm seeing.
yeah. So like the styles, stylistically, it goes from stuff like this that's like highly rendered, really realistic, very graphic, black and white, sort of in the tradition of like R. Crumb and
I was going to say, I definitely see our crumb in there when I just saw the
yeah,
first. Yeah. And how did you
yeah,
decide, like when you start, thank you so much. That's very helpful for me. And then it's a different style, right? The back,
yeah,
is
and then it
that the
switches
story
to this
too?
sort of yeah, so it switches back and forth from these like highly rendered images to, let me find a good example, to like kind of like what I like to call like a wonky Mary Blair style, where it's
I
very
love
like
that.
it's very like shape based, but it's definitely not as like clean and pretty as Mary Blair's work, which I looked at and admire a lot and am influenced by for that style too. Yeah.
What came first? Like, how did you first embark on this project?
So I've been an illustrator for a long time, and I've worked professionally for clients ranging from like Random House to Scholastic. I've illustrated other people's books. I've illustrated a lot of stuff that I got known for in illustration was like this kind of pulpy, like B movie poster type stuff. So like for my literary nerd friends out there, I did this design called like Attack of Literacy that went pretty viral online and became a really popular T-shirt. And so I was doing a lot of like T-shirt art
I
and
definitely feel like
illustration.
I've seen your stuff before. Like I'm looking at your illustration page, which, by the way, I highly recommend going to Josh's
Oh,
website and just checking out his work because it's really incredible. But I definitely see some
yeah, like the
familiar
most
things.
familiar are probably like Captain Obvious,
Yeah.
Attack of Literacy, and then this one I did called Puppet Checkup. That's like Kermit the Frog getting an X-ray, and you see like the X-ray of a hand inside of him.
Oh my
Um,
God. It's
and so
great.
it's like very like comical, kind of fun, like very like B movie riffy type art, and yet like and I was doing comics professionally, and illustration professionally, but I kept feeling this desire to tell stories that talked about truth and talked about real struggles. And quite a few years back, I went through kind of a mental health crisis with my wife. We had been through some really traumatic experiences. One of which was like I got jumped and beaten in Long Beach and got like most of my portfolio stolen. This is always a fun interview, right? for this story, because it always starts pretty heavy. But I remember like so there was like PTSD and a lot of issues after that. And my wife already struggles with panic disorder. And I struggle with like severe depression. And so it's like just this perfect cocktail. Like we moved to Portland, Oregon, and we're isolated from friends and family, which is
How
like
long ago
where,
when did you move?
that was probably like back in 2006. So
Okay.
yeah. And then so we found ourselves in this kind of perfect cocktail situation where, you know, as those of us who like suffer from mental illness know, like it always wants you isolated, it always wants you alone, it always wants you panicked, it always wants you like in your own head and not really like seeking out like contact or connection with the world. And definitely tries to convince you that like you're alone in it. You're alone in the struggle. And so like one of the struggles with that going through it was, you know, I felt very suicidal. My wife was having massive panic attacks. And it got to the point where I literally like was like on Burnside Bridge, like standing on the edge of it, ready to jump off. And luckily I kind of froze. And at the time I felt like I was being a coward by freezing and not doing it, because that's where my mental process had gone at that point. But it had gotten so heavy. And yet what was weird was whenever like, you know, before and after the bridge incident, if I tried to like talk to people about it, they would sort of pretty up the conversation or change the topic or try to like go, well, on the bright side, you know, and
just in talking about depression at all, or talking about, I mean, what was like anything that you described that you were
mainly
working
about
through?
Yeah, mainly about depression, about like suicidal ideation, and panic and anxiety. And like the topic just always was like wanting to shift. Even from like really close, great friends of mine who like do care. It's just a hard topic to broach because like nobody talks about it.
That's
So
right.
I remember when my wife and I kind of we got through that experience, and that's a lot of what this book is about. But coming out of it, I became convinced to go back to college to finish my graduate degree, which I had dropped out of during the time when I had gotten jumped. And what was interesting was coming back to graduate school. I knew I wanted to focus on work that was like, what would I do if like money weren't an object? You know, like would I be making like gimmicky t-shirts that are cool and I would wear myself. Like I have a pretty strong sense of humor and I love that stuff. That's why I did it, you know. But would I be doing that, or would I be doing something more like attempting to write like literature in the medium that I love and also talk about something that I feel is important to talk about and talk about openly? Because I think one of the most difficult things about when you're going through struggles, like you know, and if you look up the statistics on it, it's like a very large percentage of men have hardcore suicidal ideation at some point in their lives. A good percentage of women and men suffer from panic disorder and anxiety. Mental illness is not like as rare or as kind of as something that needs to be treated with kid gloves as I think our
Agreed.
society likes to
Yeah,
treat it.
absolutely. I think the kid gloves is actually stigma. I mean, I just think
agree.
it's like blatantly like scared. Like, oh, what will
Totally.
happen if I actually talk about suicide? Like
Yeah.
someone, you know, may fall prey to it, but it's
Yeah.
like, that's actually what's like leading to.
For me, that did not help. Like not talking about it didn't help or help me to like get through it, because like part of it was feeling like I was this unique person going through this unique experience that like no one could relate to. Which is very like you know, even now I have occasional bouts of depression, and it's like it always, when I'm out of it, I can always kind of see it as like my mindset almost gets to like where it was when I was a teenager, you know.
I know.
But it's one of those things where I think it's important to talk about honestly, directly, and to kind of encourage people by talking about our experiences. Like that's why I really wanted to be on your podcast, Because I think it's so great that you talk really openly about struggles with mental illness, that you have a website to help people deal with that. I think that's really important. And I see that more and more. It encourages me a lot. I'm seeing that in our society. Like I love, like there's a show called The Mental Illness Happy Hour. That's one of my
It's so
favorite
good.
too.
Yeah. And have
Where
you
this,
listened to The Hilarious World of Depression, I assume?
Yes. And I just like, I love that people are being vulnerable and opening up about it. And that's why I created this book, is
It's
to
so
try
great.
to kind of be a part of that conversation and help people out there. And the cool thing is like, it just released today, but I've already heard from readers who have gone through bouts of depression. I also talk really openly about caregiving in it, because when you're dealing with someone else who's suffering from mental illness, there is a whole caregiving element to it that a lot of people aren't open about either. And so that can make somebody in a caregiving situation feel like they're like this imperfect, terrible person. Cause like one day they're just like, I don't really want to buy groceries today. Like, could you get off the couch? And you know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
which
totally.
is terrible,
Yeah.
but we've, these are things people deal with. And I think like, in order to be able to kind of, to feel less isolated and alone, we need to hear other people's stories with that. So in that scenario, like I've gotten emails from people who've suffered from depression and felt like a lot of hope from reading the book, which is weird because it's not like the most hopeful book. but
not feeling alone. Not feeling alone is one of the most hopeful
Yeah.
things in the whole world. When you sat down to write your book, I mean, did you do it first as words, or like what was your process around that?
Yeah, so like I said, it's in like 2 volumes, so it's kind of neat because I have right now I'm in the thick of the second book. But what I do is I have like the story arc mapped out, like that I mapped out years ago, and that's just like the bullet points. And the way that I structure the story is pretty transparent. So if you buy the story, it's like I intentionally am like, I started off with the stakes, and I call it the stakes, like so what the stakes are in the story. When there's conflict, when there's rising action, like that's usually the title of the chapter, is based on the structure of the story. So that's what I work out first, is just like plot points. Next, I script it out, and I fully script it out. I send it to editors that I know, because when I first made the book, I didn't have a publishing deal at first for it. And so I just kind of forged forward, but I did send it to a lot of editors I knew. Some people like Deanna Schutz, she's brilliant. She's like was the senior editor at Dark Horse and worked with like Frank Miller, and like
that's amazing.
People are like way better than me, like Dave Sim, like legends in the comic world. But for some reason, she saw a lot of potential in what I was doing, and so gave me a lot of really valuable feedback early on in that script stage. So I do that script, and then from there, I break down the script and do like roughs. And I'm pretty transparent about that too. So I usually post them to Instagram as I'm doing them. And part of that, like you're a writer too, so you probably know it's like you kind of need methods of accountability to make sure you're making progress. And for me, the best accountability is like public visual accountability. So I've set myself a goal to try to post like one thing a day. And if that's like at the rough stage, I need to rough out 1 page a day. If it's like, even if it's scripting, it's like I need to post like 1 page of progress a day.
And do you post that as well? You post the scripting
all
stuff?
on Instagram. Yeah. And
it's just
it's a little scary because it's vulnerable, and it's like when you see a rough, it's not going to look like as high quality as the final, but it's like a psychological trick for me to keep going on making the books. And then from there, I'll shoot photo references. And then I basically rough out the pages, sketch them, like draw them on paper, and then I ink them on like these giant 18 by 24.
Do you have one there?
Bristle.
I was just curious.
I'll go grab one.
I want to see it.
So I have them all like kept in this giant thing. And I exhibited a couple of these like for my grad project because that's how it started. And then, but yeah, so here, I think I have the cover. I can show you that.
And by the way,
So
all this time you also, oh my, it's so beautiful.
yeah,
It's
so it's
so
like,
cool. It's
and I
so
like
detailed.
working, yeah, I like working this big because when it reduces down, it just looks like impossibly detailed.
Absolutely. Wait, how does it reduce? Like, what happens next? What happens to that? You then send that in
So
to
then
the
I have
publisher?
to, so what I do is I scan it because I've worked in illustration and then I'm an art director full time. So
Yeah.
I do book layout and stuff all the
Yeah.
time. And so what I do is scan it in 8s because it's gigantic. And then I'll piece together the scans and kind of clean them up and then basically do the book layout from there. Yeah, it's a crazy way to write stories.
It is crazy. I mean, when I think about, I worked with an illustrator and a designer for my book, and you know, there is a little bit of this handoff quality. So I know what my job is, and then I get to hand it off. But the idea that you are in charge of like all of the parts, like not only the writing, not only the idea, not only the writing, not only the style, then the execution of every illustration is just, it's just feels like so much work to me. It's amazing.
Yeah, it's kind of addictive. It's a weird thing. Like most cartoonists I know and meet all suffer from weird mental illnesses.
Yeah,
for sure.
I believe that. I totally believe that.
I think we're all a little obsessive and maybe
there's like a puzzle quality, right? I mean, it's like the same people who love puzzles.
Yeah, and I think there's an element of control with it for sure too, because like the cool thing about that medium is it's the most controlled medium I can imagine. It's like you usually aren't going to be able to like film an entire movie on your own, be the cast, be the screenwriter, be the costume designer, you know, basically be everything. And then with novels, I mean, they're definitely comparable, but you don't have a lot of control over the visual, which is actually one of the great things about novels. But with comics, like the cool thing about it is you're kind of able to do all of it as one human being. And there's, you know, there's a slew of cartoonists out there doing that. And I think that's why, because it's like, it's one of the few areas where like, you're not going to have like some boardroom kind of screw up your whole project. And so, yeah, so that's kind of,
how much time did it take, considering that you have a full-time gig? I mean, or you are a full-time worker as an art director and illustrator. How much time did it take to work on this? And you also have a daughter, right? You have a child?
Son,
Oh, son. Okay. So you also were super busy as a parent. I mean, how did you make time for this?
So I think it's interesting because my son is autistic, and we found that out like luckily at an early enough age to get him like speech therapy and stuff like that. And like a lot of people, you know, I'm somebody who like I said, I've had, you know, suffered from depression and stuff like for a good chunk of my life, and have anxiety and all sorts of issues. And what's interesting is seeing my son and some of the telltale things for like autism. I definitely think I'm probably on like the kind of Asperger end of the spectrum of autism, and just manage to somehow function. But I definitely think that just like the more I know,
there
the
are
more
resonances. There are resonances.
Like, yeah. And she's like, that's why you don't pick up, like, because I've always been bad at like picking up social cues with people. Or like sticking to like one specific topic in a conversation that I'm interested in. And so it's been interesting, but I think because of that, I think that's given me a real strength in like just being really stubborn with my work habits. Like I get kind of militant about it. So with my son, it's like once he's in bed, from about 9 o'clock to like 2 a.m. is my work time. And then that's how I manage to get pages done. And I'm a big advocate for that sort of thing. If you're a person who feels like you're kind of put here for whatever reason to kind of make something, like you feel like you're supposed to write a novel or write a great epic graphic novel or whatever it is that you feel like you're meant to do. I have a lot of friends who are like highly talented who have not done a book and have the book they're going to do kind of that just gets pushed and pushed and pushed. And I do think like carving out, even if it's like 30 minutes a day to kind of work towards your goal of getting those things done really helps. And that's kind of what I did, was just, I realized like, if I don't do this today, it's just going to be tomorrow that I don't do it, and then the next day, and then I'm going to be 50 and not have a book, and then I'm going to be 60 and not have a book, and it's just going to continue.
What does it feel like to actually have that book today? Today's the
It
day.
feels good. It feels, but it's funny because we talking about like overthinking, right?
Yeah.
It feels good, and yet it's also incredibly anxious.
Yes.
It's like I know from working on other books for like I illustrated a book a long time ago for Insight Editions called Barbarians, a Handbook for Aspiring Savages. And I know like that was a hilarious book, and it had a decent amount of distribution and a good publisher, and yet like it just didn't fly.
No. Yeah.
Something about it just didn't launch. And so I know, and I've been a part of other projects like that. So I've been at it long enough to like not expect like tomorrow, like the New York Times to call me up and be like, oh, let's have an interview about your brilliant book by an indie publisher, But there is the anxiety of like, I also know the work you have to kind of do in order to promote.
Yeah.
And so I overthink everything. And so it's just sort of like, there's this kind of fine balance of putting a book out where I think you have to try to maintain, like, first off, I have to maintain productivity on my next book.
Right.
Because I'm on the hook for two of these. And also I'm going to try to do the second one in a much quicker fashion. Now that my son's much older, it's like, there's a little bit of more of a window. But yeah, it's weird. It's like I'm mixed with, I get these brief fleeting moments as a creative of joy. Like when I got the proof in the mail, I was like, yeah, I did it. And then it was like the next day where I was like, I got to do the next thing. I got to get this thing to, so it is weird. It's like, I'm really ecstatic about it and I'm proud of it. I know I hope it doesn't sound cocky. I think when you're a writer, when you've done something good though. And this is like one of the first times I put something out where I have like no doubts about it. Like,
oh God, that's really amazing. That's amazing. What a great feeling.
Yeah. So that's good. And I'm excited about people reading it. So that's good. But it is funny with the overthinking,
do you think you're overthinking? Yeah. Is your overthinking around this about it getting out there and like wanting to like promote that, or is it something else around releasing it? Because I say this because I had a lot of feelings. Like I felt like sort of vulnerable, like very vulnerable.
Yeah.
It's almost like some sort of like debutante coming out feeling. It's like everyone's judging you. I don't know. It's just very vulnerable.
I have a good example of why it's a little awkward sometimes. Like, so like this podcast, like I'm so excited about being on because it's like, it's about a lot of what I address in the book. And so there's a natural level of comfort that I have coming into it because I'm like, I've listened to your podcast. I know that like you're cool with vulnerability, right?
Love it.
But like, like I the local newspaper here, which I'm really thankful for, they ran an article on it. And of course it was like, artist uses art as therapy. That's the title. And I'm like, no, that's not, I mean, it kind of, but not.
Yeah.
But I understand it because it's like a weird book to promote. And it's a weird feeling to kind of, it's like, and you did this too, but it's like we kind of write ourselves into a situation where we have to open with vulnerability.
Yeah.
And so in a weird way, it's like, it's a mix of freeing and also terrifying because it's like, I don't talk to everyone I know about like, hi, how's it going? Like,
hey, I have experienced suicidal ideation.
I tried to kill myself, like,
I know.
So
do you think have you noticed anyone, well, okay, what do you want people to know about suicidal ideation in particular? Like, is that seems like a really crucial moment in the book. Like, was that something that you really were trying? Because that seems like such a hard one to communicate a mindset around. Like, was it important to you to try to do that?
I do. I want people to understand where people are at in that frame of mind, where I've been at when I was in that frame of mind, and I have to be cautious and like kind of use a lot of techniques and different skills I've developed throughout the years kind of make sure I avoid going there.
Yeah.
And avoiding is the wrong word. I just need to kind of nip the negative thinking
Yes.
at
I always
but
describe it
rather
as
than,
like to avoid, it's not avoiding, it's just like not taking this path.
yeah,
Like
like
you're just like taking
sometimes
past it.
that road isn't heading in a good direction.
Yeah.
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 Um, and so I do think it's important for people to understand that, like, people when they're going through that, they have their own rationalization, and a lot of people going through it aren't like necessarily insane. Like they might actually just be interpreting things
Not at
that
all.
really
Yeah.
suck
Yeah.
about our world, you know?
Yeah.
And so it's like, and I've read statistics on that too, where people who tend to be more informed about the world actually are more prone to depression. And so I would not saying that I'm more informed. I'm an idiot when it comes to a lot of things, but the point being, like, I think that the more you learn about the world, like, depression is a possible issue that you're going to be struggling with, and especially when you start dealing with like social pressures that I think most of us and I know a lot of men are put under, to like kind of grin and bear it,
Mm.
to just kind of tough it out, to like man it out, not talk about it, and also just to like sort of to just make massive amounts of money. I mean, that's the mass pressure of our whole society. I think on all of us, you know, is like, you have to consume, you have to like make a lot of money. If you're a creative, you have to be the top creative. If you have a book, it has to be a New York Times
Right.
bestseller. Um,
Right.
all of these pressures that are both internal and societal, I think it's important to kind of talk about, and I think it's good to give a realistic depiction of it, because now that I have like a 7-year-old son who like wasn't even conceived when when I was on a bridge, it really is stunning to me, and a bit terrifying that like I could have um, cut that potential future off, by doing a really emotionally stupid, making one bad decision could kind of have ended all of
Or
that.
just losing perspective. I mean, I feel like
Yeah,
so much of what we talk about is just like we lose perspective, and as a result things go massively haywire. What do you,
100%. So,
does your
yeah,
does your son know that you have this book? Like, what does he know? He's 7 years old. What does he know about the book?
he knows dad has a book out, and he knows that I do. It's funny, like, to kids, that like what their parents do is never really like all that amazing.
True.
Like, I mean, he thought it was cool. Like, we worked on I can't talk about the company, but like at my day job, we work with like some pretty huge clients, and one of them's a giant video game company that has a certain iconic character that kids are kind of obsessed with, that I grew up with in the 80s.
Ooh.
And we got to do like a bunch of collectible items for them. And
Yeah.
I think that's the most excited he's ever been
Yeah.
about like sort of
Yeah.
what I do creatively, because he was like, I know that character. But but yeah, like I definitely, this book is not for children.
Right.
So I
Right.
haven't really let him read them.
Yeah.
And that's another reason, like, when I work on this book, I also work on it pretty late. So he'll get a glimpse of like, he's got an interesting life for a kid, because his mom is a children's book illustrator, and
Wow.
then I'm a art director and a cartoonist. So he's just around like people who are like, I can't talk now, I'm drawing,
Right.
all the time. So I think when he grows up and realizes like that's not like, most people don't just draw for a living, he might be like, hey, that was pretty cool. But yeah,
Does he
he has
draw?
a
Does he draw?
knowledge. Yeah, he draws awesome, like 7-year-old drawing
Right.
style.
Right.
It's pretty brilliant. But it's fun to see him like kind of, he hasn't really been like taught to make everything a symbol yet.
Mm,
And so that makes me happy. Like, it's fun to see when he's free and he's not like, oh, you draw a star this way, right?
totally.
Because I feel like the second we start learning in art education, like the second children start learning like, well, you use a triangle and a square to make a house, I think that tends to kind of almost ruin people's natural ability to draw and their growth in that. And I think it can stifle it. So it's fun to see before kind
I
of the
love
system
that.
can come in and be like, this is what a face looks like, a circle with,
That is so
yeah.
right. I feel like you're so right about that. All of my worst habits are, or my terrible visual habits are from something that I thought is a shape that I'm
Yeah.
supposed to use.
Yeah, and like we all have it, and then there's this point where some of us like try to actually start drawing what we really see, and I think most of us do, and I think it's just a difference between the people who are kind of crazy enough to be like, no, I'm just going to keep at this until I can, and the
Yeah.
people who are like, well, I don't know, because I always drew a house right before when I was doing the triangle and the square, and now this like sucks, like so. I definitely feel like it's uh, in art education, like people could focus more on kind of teaching kids to draw what they see, like, and to kind of see and experience and express rather than just kind of like code it. And because it is a weird, the drawing part, it's very much like English in the sense where there's like structure.
Mm.
But I feel like unlike English, a lot of the time, a lot of the early structure we're being taught is just not really conducive for like expression,
Do
So,
yes. Do you think that anything would have been different for you if you had been doing this kind of work back during the bridge time? Like, do, do you think that communicating your story or using your talents in this way might have helped you back then?
yeah, I mean, I've always been pretty open with people, so that's one thing I have had, whether they like it or not.
I think
um
it's a great trait.
oh, okay. um but yeah, like I do think talking about it in art, I think because art is visual communication, like visual art is, and so I think that if you are used to communicating visually and you're going through something you haven't communicated visually, you're going to feel like a muted person, like somebody's pressed mute. and
Mm-hmm.
and that sort of thing, like the not talking about, much very similar to like not talking about these issues like with your friends or relatives, or like just openly, honestly, I think without the ability to do that, people start feeling isolated. So I
Mm.
definitely would say I think that by working through this, it has helped me,
It's going to be
as
even
well
more
as,
when people read it and come back to you. I feel like
yeah,
that's the process of like real healing. So that's just starting.
100%.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because the second book gets more heavily into like some of the harder stuff like that I haven't fully dealt with. Like I've
Mm.
dealt with a lot of my depression, and through different means, and one of them is through being creative. Like I think that we're not meant to just consume and like burn things. Like I think we're meant to build and make things, and I think that goes like physically. Like I think we're meant to work. Like we're meant to physically exercise. And like, so if we don't exercise and we start feeling bad, even though it's hard work to do, it's like the benefit of it long term psychologically is way better. That's helped me. I think like creatively, we're supposed to be working out. Like we're supposed to be putting stuff out creatively and making things, whether that's like making your own food, making making, like, I don't know, build a car in your garage, whatever it is.
You could not be more right, Josh, by the way.
Yeah.
You could not be more right. I feel like that is the path towards helping your mental health, your emotional well-being, like
Yeah.
is to start making in some way.
Yeah, and so I think by doing things that are like you're making and you're producing rather than consuming, I think the more you can move away from just flat out consumption. And keep in mind, I love consuming a lot of things. Like I'm obsessed with Mandalorian right now. It's one of the best things ever. um, but at the same time, like I think you have to find a fine balance where you are putting out as much as you're taking, or consuming. And I have noticed, like with friends of mine and relatives who like suffer with mental health issues, usually if they're in a bout of like not creating or making, like they spiral
Mm.
worse. And so I've observed that in myself and in others. So that's helped. a huge part of kind of the second book that's interesting and been difficult to read is when it starts getting into some of the, like, when I was beaten and some other heavier stuff that I still think there's some trauma, even though I've dealt with it. And that's been really, I'd say, much more, almost more vulnerable to write about, which is strange.
Have you
But this
ever
whole,
experienced EDMR, by the way? EDMR,
no,
is
I
that what it's called?
haven't.
Yeah, yeah. Do you know what it is?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard of it, and I've
I only ask
read on it.
because people have said just such amazing things about discrete trauma experiences
Yeah,
with this rapid eye movement. I mean, it just sounds like
yeah,
there's something about retelling your story in the right environment when with this eye movement that seems
yeah.
to like change. I'm just very curious about it. I want to hear more from more people that do it. So
Yeah,
just
I'm
curious.
actually really curious about it too. I think that sounds pretty fascinating, and
Yeah.
I'd be open to it.
Yeah.
Um, there's other things that have helped. Like, one of the key things I'd say is, I mean, definitely, like, medication when you need it is
I
smart.
love it.
And I had a stigma against it. I even address it in the book, but it's like I used to be that guy who, like, anyone who goes through panic disorder or depression or anything, like, hates, because I'd just be like, just tough it out. Like, you've got the power and the will,
But
right?
that's also
Like,
part of the depression. You know what I mean? Like when
yeah,
we say like it wants you to be alone, it wants you to
yeah,
do this, it also does not want you to take medication. I always, when
totally.
people
Like,
have anxiety, I'm always like, that or fight medication so hard. I'm like, yeah, it's because you have anxiety. Like
yeah.
you're fighting the thing you need most.
For sure. Yeah. And some of that has to do with, I think we addressed this, like, before we, did this,
The
but we were
control.
talking about control.
Yeah.
And I think that has a huge part of it too. Like, we like to pretend we're in full control of ourselves and our
Yeah.
lives. And there is something about finding healing in letting go of control and sort of accepting that you need help in whatever way that is. And I think that for me, like, yeah, there's definitely been times, even now to this day, where I will have times in my life where I will be on medication and times where I'm not. And usually my measure of that is, like, if I'm having a really good day and I'm walking outside and I'm like, this is awesome, I should kill myself, I'm like, okay,
Oh.
it's like, that's not a normal, just
Mm-hmm.
random thought to have in your head. Like, when
Mm.
things, especially when it's not situational, it's like, and that happens to me every once in a while. And so it's like, that's where I usually am like, okay, I need to be on medication.
Mm.
um and then when I've like, usually also tied in with that, like, I haven't been working out, I haven't been, there's a lot of other things in life that I need to be doing. But once I'm at a state where I don't feel the need for it, and I know it's not just like that temporary state that you have like a couple weeks in where you're like, I feel good now, I'm gone. But like a year in or whatever, if I'm feeling like I can handle kind of ebbing down from it, and my doctor agrees, like, I definitely will. But it's funny because I was so hesitant to do medication until having a son. When I had a son, I just realized, like, I had a day like that where I was walking around and that was a random thought. And I was like, I can't have that thought. Like,
Right.
if I have that thought, that's like messing with my kid's father. Like, that's
Mm-hmm.
just not cool. So that's when I went to the doctor, and, like, they did the whole checklist and were like, yeah, you need to be on that medication. So I think that's a good thing we shouldn't rule out. I definitely think exercise is a weird thing. I grew up, like, hating sports and just was kind of a nerdy, like, literary kid, and, like, kind of like had negative associations with, like, people who were athletic, because I was just like, well, they're
Yeah.
just like meatheads.
Yeah.
And as I've gotten older, the more I've realized, like, no, it's like really important exercise to kind of feed your mind as well. And also to keep the stamina to be able to do, like, the stuff we do, because we're
Mm-hmm.
creatives, right? So it's
Mm-hmm.
like, if I'm needing to, like, write after working, I work as an art director, so that means it can range from, like, I'm in for 6 hours, or it could be like a 17-hour day, and it just depends on when the deadline is and what needs to get out. So when I'm balancing that on top of, like, sort of my own creative work, um, if I want to sustain that, like I have to sustain my body. And so that's a huge thing. So
I mean, I literally think of it as taking care of your brain. Like
yeah,
you have to move around to take care of your brain.
yeah, for sure. And
yeah.
yeah. And also that's also just one of those, talking to people about it is good, because the first thing you do when you talk to like a professional about mental health struggles, I think most legitimate professionals will ask you like 3 questions at first. You know,
Are you
and it's
thinking of
like,
hurting yourself? Yeah. Those.
well, yeah, those two, but they'll also ask if you've been eating, if you've been sleeping, and if you've been exercising.
Yeah, those
and
are.
how
Yeah.
have you been eating, and how have you been sleeping, and how have you been exercising? And like what's weird is if one of those 3 is missing, like most of the work you do will help, but it's not going to solve a lot of core issues that are just caused specifically by just eating bad, like not sleeping well, which as somebody who suffers from anxiety and stuff like that, like sleep is not a big strength of mine. Like I love sleep, but I have trouble falling asleep. That's usually when I feel most anxious. That's usually when I have the stuff go through my head that like either I have to put down as an artist, or I just am going to put internally.
Well, you sleep at weird hours too, right? I mean, is it like 2 to like 10? I don't know. What time do you usually wake up?
About like 8 in the morning. So I probably in reality am not getting enough.
You're not getting enough sleep
as a creative, but
but you also have a book delivery date. I mean, these things do come and go. Yeah, for
exactly.
Sure.
But yeah, like so I do think there's like things that I've developed. One of the things that's helped me the most is my faith. Like I'm a Christian, and I think that accepting that there's like a higher power, whatever that power is for you, I think that's really important for kind of processing the sort of crazy world we live in. Like, because
and you also weren't for a while, right? Like you went through a long 100%. Period. Yeah.
I spent about, and I talk about that in the book too, but I spent about, a good 15 years as like a hardcore atheist. And I still to this day can argue myself wrong because of it. Because I know that what I believe like relies, pretty much 100% on faith. And I think a spiritual experience. And I don't think people are going to change other people's minds about their belief systems like that, like by harping on it or having a certain political persuasion. I don't think any of that's effective. But I do think like spiritually it's possible. But I think like having a belief in some kind of spiritual power, having a belief that there's a purpose, I think that for me was one of the most difficult things that drove me to sort of suicidal ideation, was the idea of a life with no purpose or an invented purpose. Because for me, it was just so hard to navigate, like, well, why should I be okay with just making up my own purpose? Like, because I'm an overthinker. So I'm like, I'm not okay with that. Like, that seems like it cancels itself out. Like so like being able to embrace the idea of a greater purpose outside of this life has actually been really helpful, and very comforting. And which I wouldn't say why I believe it is because of comfort, but I would say there's a lot of comfort from believing it. So it's definitely a good byproduct, but I definitely think that helps too. So I think spirituality, like having a faith in something greater than yourself, exercise, processing, discussing, vulnerability is huge too. And that's why I love what you're doing with this podcast. Like, I think having vulnerable discussions with people, being open about like, hey, I tried this thing, it didn't really work. I tried this works for me. I like that approach that you have too, where you're like, I mean, because a lot of this is also not like black and white. And I think black and white thinking can actually lead to a lot of depression, especially for people like us that are problem solvers and overthinkers.
Yes.
It's like you're trying to find the solution, so you're going to overthink. And sometimes there's no clear-cut solution. Like my depression is not solved. Like it's not like I can write a check to depression and be like, we're paid off, like you're done. I even like to call it, like, and I use the visual of this, but I like to call it like a dark cloud. I've heard other people have different nicknames.
Yeah. I mean, weather is often a metaphor for how the mind works, how emotions work, like how emotions come and go and move, weather patterns. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's interesting because, my wife, similarly, a lot of the things I'm talking about have helped her as well with panic and anxiety. And it's funny because we always joke that we're kind of the reverse of the spectrum, in the sense that, like, I kind of freak out because I'm looking at the past, and
that's
she freaks out
depression,
looking
and
at
that's the future. Yep. That's anxiety. I mean, people always say depression is the past, anxiety is the future. That's really classic. I think it's so interesting that it's taken us well, I'm 46, so it's taken us so long to figure out really basic things about like eating and exercise, and like they're so obvious, but when I was younger, I never thought like, oh, you might be thirsty. Take care of yourself in the most basic way.
Yeah. And a lot of what helped me with that too was having a son, was like, because like the thing you're taught when you have a newborn is like, you want to ask yourself 3 questions when you have your child, right? Like when they're upset, you're like, do they need to sleep? Do they need to eat? And have they gone to the restroom? Like, basically. And it's like, those are basic questions we ask about newborns. And yet, like, I barely know anybody who, because we're so present in our own realities.
I know.
As humans, we're kind of stuck in our own perception of things.
Yes.
That we can forget to ask the most basic questions of ourselves that we would ask a newborn. Yes. And yet, we're a human as well, who have needs, and we need food, and we need exercise, and we need, restroom breaks, whatever it is.
Yes.
And yet we won't ask ourselves half the time that. And that actually ties into one of the biggest solutions that I've found. Not that it's a final solution, because there is none. Like, these are things I think a lot of us will be living with for life.
Oh yeah.
And like I said, my wife and I have nicknames for our thing, because it's like, oh, I mean, part of it's identifying it, which I think is what's important about a book like the one I'm writing too, where it's like, it's important to identify what it is. Like, it's important I know that for my wife, finding out more about panic disorder has actually helped her not have massive panic attacks a lot, because when you know when you know your enemy, right, like, you can better deal with it. And so for me, like, being able to accept, like, you know what, like, I have issues with depression, and I need to face that head on. Like, but it helps me also to be able to identify when I hear depression talking, and know that it's not me. It's this thought, that it's this annoying friend that shows up.
Does your wife help you too? My husband, like, can spot it now. He's like, that's that. And then that helps me start to learn to spot it. It's hard because you have to separate 2 voices that sound exactly the same in your head. They're both you, but like the one is actually, it's just hard to get used to.
Yeah. And it's hard, like, because as a person who overthinks and a problem solver, it's like, you also are like, that's actually helped me a lot in my life as well. Like, part of why I'm able to do well as an art director is I'm really good at troubleshooting and problem solving and thinking ahead.
Yes.
To be able to kind of prevent future errors, right? Yes. Like, which is a huge, like, that's essential for like managerial work, and especially managerial work where it's project based, and like, failure could lead to a mass loss in money, right?
Yes.
So it's a benefit. It's helped me in my life, but some of that can also cause you to doubt things, like being able to just go, well, that's not just sort of situational, where you're like trying to look at an issue that can be resolved. That's impossible and negative thinking. And it's so hard, I think, for people like us in that, where to be able to navigate between the two. So yeah, it is helpful to have a partner who will just call it out, be like, you're not like trying to solve a problem right now. You're you're doing like negative thinking. And and then of course, as creatives, we also have we have a whole cornucopia of fun things to deal with. Like, there's also imposter syndrome, so which I think most writers and artists have, and that's always in there too. So it's just like,
well, the problem is, especially if you're a reader or you love, let's say, comic books, you are deeply versed in the greatest of all time, right? Like, you have read
Yeah.
When my first job was in book publishing, and I worked with Nobel Prize winners, no joke.
Yeah.
I was like at this house that was like known for the greatest European writing. And it made me think, like, what do I actually have to say? Like, how could I say anything compared to the greatest writers of all time? Like,
Oh yeah.
and it's just the wrong scale, and it's the wrong thing to be asking. But it's hard not to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I will say there's a guy in our industry that you won't hear a lot of cartoonists talk about. I mean, they will talk about because he's the best, I think, alive in the industry for the type of comics I do. But it's Chris Ware.
I was gonna say it's Chris Ware. I was thinking Chris Ware, right?
I mean,
yeah.
He's no doubt just like a genius, one of the most prolific cartoonists who's ever lived, and literally just writes masterpieces, and it's untouchable. It's just I don't know any cartoonist who's lived before that's touched what he's doing.
Yeah.
And so whenever I always buy a Chris Ware book, but I try to book like 2 weeks of just.
I feel you. I totally feel
the residue afterwards of like trying to regain my ground to be a creative, because I definitely can fall prone to like this sort of comparative thing where I'm like, and one other thing that's helped is just as I've gotten to know, like I'm a member of the National Cartoonist Society in Los Angeles, and the imposter syndrome in me when I got let in was like, are you guys sure you want to let me in? Like, this is like you guys are big people. I'm nobody, you know? But what's interesting is there are some really heavy hitter cartoonists in there who've, you know, been published. They've had movie deals, things like that. And some of them are like legends, like they're written into the whole history of cartooning. And I meet them and I realize like they have similar struggles.
Oh, absolutely.
Most of them feel exactly the same way about their work. Most of them also have to take work that they don't like for the money or for whatever. And most of them are dreaming of that opportunity to do books like what I just did. And so it's like, that's helped me as well, like have a more realistic assessment of myself and my standing, is just meeting some of my heroes and meeting some of the cartoonists who've been at it for a while, who I just look at as like, you're on this different plane. And then you talk to them and you realize like, no, we're all human. And that's just like, you know, ideation of a difference.
It's a super important point. I wonder, Josh, if you would sometime collect for me like a reading list of we want to include your book in it, but like some of the books that have really talked about emotional well-being or mental health as comic books or graphic novels. Like, what are some of your favorites? I would love to hear that. Maybe for the site too. Okay, it's time to go, but I could talk to you for a really long time. I want to hear a lot more about your faith. It's really interesting, but I'm going to read your book, and then maybe we can circle back for the next book.
Cool. Sounds great. And thank you so much for having me on. It's been fun. I love what you do with the podcast. I think it's really important. And I do think it's cool to see other people in the fight that we're all kind of.
I know. I feel like I can really relate to you. Like so many of the things you say, I'm like, yep. It's interesting how similar. I mean, I always say this about overthinkers, but like I immediately feel like I understand other overthinkers so quickly, even from like totally different backgrounds, totally different places. Like, but there's something about that, our spin and our like constant desire to figure things out, that's like very similar.
Totally.
Take care, Josh.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.